Hey, what's going on, everyone? We are here with Die with the Most Likes and Culture Hacker, a super rad digital artist brought to you by FakeWhale, of course. Much appreciated for their curation and connecting us because, it's tough to sift through a lot of stuff here. So, when they originally had kind of approached me and said, hey, do you want to do an interview with Culture Hacker? I hadn't heard of you initially, so I gave you the follow, and I was looking through all your stuff, and it is insane. It's an absolute whirlwind of kind of crazy AI mixtures with a bunch of human kind of mergers in there and stuff. It's really rad. So I don't know if we want to start out and just give a little about yourself. I feel like for artists, people always ask when you started making, but it's kind of irrelevant in many ways as an artist. I feel like when is just always. You were always probably making shit. But if you want to go through kind of how you kind of found your style that I've kind of noticed, or kind of how you've gone about kind of refining that, I think that would be a solid place to start.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me. It's awesome to be here, and I'm excited to be able to talk about my artistic practice. So thank you.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, I've been making art for a long time. I started with film, experimental film.
Mm.
Working with like a Bolex camera and 16 millimeter and kind of processing it myself back when I was in high school. And I did a lot with still photography. And then from there, I went on to kind of start working in commercial production, and started like as a film runner, and then became a camera, production assistant, a camera assistant, a camera operator, DP, director, producer, and traveled the world working on like music videos, fashion, documentaries, a whole bunch of feature films, television.
Cool.
And so I think in a lot of ways, I bring a lot of that cinematography to what I do. Like I'm interested in like composition, interested in this idea of trying to give an emotion to what the pieces are, or almost like I treat them like they're kind of like scenes in some ways. And I've been working with emergent technology for, well, over 20 some odd years, and I do a lot with like my own code. I do glitch processing, things with artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, AR, VR, and do a lot of physical installations too, like
Oh,
large scale installations. And so the in terms of the crypto art, it's really kind of an extension of those things. I like kind of approach it from the standpoint of like sometimes I'm sparked by, because I'm a writer by trade, like when I write, I might write based upon a scene or a location or a character, a theme. And I do a similar thing with the art. I'll be struck by something, and a lot of the faces that I have are actually deep fakes that I'll do. Sometimes they're found things. It just depends. And I'm like way into this idea of deconstructing things and reconstructing them.
yeah.
That's true across the films that I've made and the installations. A lot of times it's kind of related to things being malleable, or like the way memory is. And I love when somebody can see something in it that they take, it ignites their imagination, hopefully, so that's kind of a little bit where it kind of comes from, and some of the ways that I do it. And I'm influenced by a whole bunch of different artistic movements and different
Yeah.
work, things like
Yeah, it's
that.
interesting. I mean, I feel like that's partially maybe why I was so drawn to your art in the first place, because I'm also a writer, and I feel like, it's something that's missing from a lot of art, where it's just made as this kind of characterless beige orb that's meant for consumption only, versus there being a story, or there being some type of thread that you can pull, not necessarily dictated to you, but something that's there that's potentially intangible, but within the motion of a lot of your pieces, there's a story to be told there. So I think that's the difference in maybe the part that is super interesting about your backstory is that, like, with the cinematography stuff, you really can feel it in the pieces in terms of the way that they move. So there is all sorts of tiny little just tiny little, like, I don't even know what to call them, just little nuances and things that you can kind of pull and tug from, much like a kind of a filmmaker would, I would imagine, go about making something. So that's pretty cool. Yeah. Yeah. What do you write? Like what's your kind of go-to for writing?
Well, I do a lot of like genre stuff, I guess you could say. Like I'm
Cool.
way into like I've done psychological horror pieces. I've made like genre work, and then I've done like some docs as well. But in terms of the writing, I'm usually drawn towards genre,
Mm,
usually psychological horror related, sometimes body horror. It just
hmm.
depends.
Yeah.
Um, I had a really cool, I had a chance. I'm a fan. Have always been a fan since high school. Was like a fan of David Cronenberg, and
Hmm.
I had a chance to work with David on a crazy project that I cooked up where you kind of trained an AI around emotional intelligence, and it had like it was really wild. You would go through a browser-based experience where you were kind of training this AI, and there were 3 simulations that you would go through, and you would train it around. It started with like 6 different emotions. It was like,
Hmm.
if I remember correctly, we were doing like fear and anger, trust and disgust, and joy and sadness, right? And you would train the AI, and you would do it through a browser thing, and what you clicked on and how you responded and how much you watched was all kind of captured, and we ran it through an algorithm, and then we used it as a way to create these physical artifacts that we had in an installation. So the narrative conceit was that David's the science and technology from David's films had been licensed to a biotech startup, and they were using it as a way to evolve humanity, right? And
That's just awesome.
we created like this like little implant that through synaptic
Oh
entanglement
shoot.
you know everything that you knew or wanted or desired before you
Yeah.
did. Kind of a play on the quantified self, right?
Sure.
And so it was part of a 3-part thing. There was a retrospective of his work and a physical installation of all his props and things, like you could sit at the bar with from Naked Lunch, and there
Oh
was
fuck yeah.
things from Dead Ringers, props from Dead Ringers, and the
Cool.
television from Videodrome, and the helmet from Videodrome, and all that stuff was there. And then we built this crazy like digital installation, simulation, and then a physical lab that you could go to, and you could see all these bio implants being grown and made, and it was really wild.
Dude, where was that
So
at? That sounds absolutely insane.
that was in Toronto at the
Okay.
TIFF, uh, 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 the light box there,
Cool.
in Toronto. Yeah. So, and it was connected. We did some stuff with the International Film Festival there, and the CFC, the Canadian Film Center.
Damn. So
So
what happens to all those artifacts once it's done? Because I mean, it sounds like such an incredible experience. And then yeah, like do those things, are those somewhere right now existing and continuing? Just yeah, like I'm just
yeah, well, a lot of the obviously the stuff from David's films and all of that side are archived
yeah,
and
yeah.
stored. The work that we do, or that I do in when I design certain things, it's always challenging in terms of the archival elements of it, right? Like
Yeah.
code changes, like, so that particular experience, because it's a number of years ago, it's from like 2013, was actually
Mhm.
built with Flash. So the only archive of it that exists now, because Flash has been discontinued due to
Yeah.
HTML5, is as video captures that I had done through walkthroughs of the
Man.
actual experience. So
Yeah.
that's what it lives as now. But with some of the other work, I'm always trying to figure out ways to archive it. Like one of the first films that I made, a feature film that I made, we made on desktop computers back in the mid to late 90s, and it represented the first all digital release of a motion picture
Whoa.
that we continue to work to archive to
Yeah.
keep it functional, right? Like, so we just
Yeah.
actually re-released it. It just came out on Blu-ray
Cool.
actually earlier this year through a label called 101 films, but film is a little bit easier to archive than the actual code-based work. Can be problematic at times.
Yeah, for sure. Man, that's nuts. I mean, so what do you think? I mean, as somebody who's been around this forever, right? Like, I mean, you're talking like 90s and, early 2000s types of, technology manipulation and, the impact it has on what I believe in many ways is the de-evolution of humankind, or rather kind of the merger between humanity and machine, which isn't that novelty of a concept. Of course, I feel like we're kind of already there, as many people have touched upon before. But what do you feel like in this kind of crazy blow up recently with AI art and Mid-Journey and all of those kind of writing prompt things? I'm interested to get your take on that. Again, as a writer, like I write a lot of crazy ass kind of absurdist, surrealist stuff that is like just nuts out there. Like I wrote a book is a fake author called Mark Baldacci, and I was supposed to be like the bastard son of David Baldacci, the psychological New York Times best-selling author. And I wrote this like crazy ass, like absurdist tale that I was like gonna put into a bunch of Hudson Newses across the world and like trick people into reading it, on a plane, where they would pick it up and think it was one thing, and then they start reading it and they're like, oh shit, this is like a disgusting, horrific novel about. But so yeah, would love to get your take on those, the prompts, like the straight up just writing prompts that go into those things, and then also just the seeming like spew of that type of art currently that's kind of just like everywhere. Like if on your timeline, it's just constant, like those manipulations in AI art. Like what are your thoughts on that kind of that evolution there?
Well, I think it's really wild. We had done, because one of the things, I'm a professor of practice at Columbia University in the School of the Arts there, and I'm jointly appointed across film and theater. And as that designation, I'm encouraged to do my practice outside of the university, bring it in. And I founded the Digital Storytelling Lab there in 2013 and have been running it ever since. We did a project back in 2018 that was for the 200th anniversary of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And we did this project called Frankenstein AI, which we ended up taking to Sundance and then did as a commission with the National Theater and took it to ITFA Doc Lab in Amsterdam. And we built out this really wild project where at the time it was early in like working with AI, often early there, especially felt like you were working with a toddler, right? Like it was incremental. You wouldn't know what you were going to get, it surprised you in ways that you didn't expect. And it was really totally crazy. And so we ended up doing this wild 3-part installation. You'd go into this dark kind of Victorian room and you'd sit down across from another person and you'd be prompted to kind of tell a story about a time that you were isolated, and then the other person would tell a story about a time they felt connected. And then there was this crazy, like the table in front of you would all of a sudden come to life, and it was like a Surface unit, like a Microsoft Surface unit.
Yeah.
And you'd have planchette that we made that you could use as a physical controller. So when you and the person across from you put your fingers on it, it activated the table, and then you could capture all the data from the conversation that you just had just by moving that around. And then we would capture all that data. And then when you walked into the next part of the installation, you walk in, there was a huge tank, plexiglass tank, glass kind of tank that had smoke circulating through it. And we were using like Touch Designer and pulling stuff from the web, the internet in real time. So it was amorphous, and then it would become human form. And there were all these drums that were in the room that were all IoT enabled, and the voice of the AI came through the drums, and then it would interact with you. And the narrative conceit of the piece was that Frankenstein's monster had been wandering the dark recesses of the internet in search of what it meant to be human. It was confused by the polarization and toxicity, extreme hate and extreme love, decided it was going to assemble humans in the real world in order to understand what it meant to be human. And the piece starts asking these crazy questions. because we trained the AI on Mary Shelley's book, Frankenstein. Then we built a chat bot that we called Fakenstein that we used as a way to talk in Shelley prose. And then we brought in all kinds of data from Reddit all over the web and created a question corpus, right? And so like the first question that the AI, the first two that were really that it ever asked were, why do humans like having sex even though they can see the color? And then what's it like to wear human, right? Like, so then the group would hear that question, they'd be like, what does it mean by wear human? Does it mean we're not human sometimes? When aren't we human? Why aren't we human? And get into this really awesome philosophical discussion. And you'd have like about 8 people in there. And then they'd say, they'd debate it, and then they'd say, okay, this is what we're committing to the machine. And then they would give a response. From all the data across the festival, we then took it and we did this machine choreographed dance piece where an AI controlled a dancer through an earpiece. And it was just totally crazy. But what was awesome about it was just like collaborating with the machine made you start to think differently about the creative process. Now, where we are now, and you asked about Mid-Journey and the prompt-based AI, it's crazy how much it's accelerated from the time that we were doing that project and how hard that project was, how much easier it is now, for depending upon how you're applying AI, right? Like Mid-Journey is a turnkey thing that you can use as like a Discord bot, right? Like, so I can use it on my phone and start making stuff. But it points to this really interesting kind of augmentation of creativity, right? Machine supported, and it leads to this notion of infinite worlds. Like if you look at like this the buzz in and around the metaverse, if you go back a couple years to No Man's Sky, which was a really cool generative game where you're traveling galaxies and it was just making the galaxies and everybody had a different experience. And in fact, when the game came out, a lot of people were upset because they were like, I don't see anybody. I can't
mine sucks.
And it was probably very realistic to what space travel is like, right? You're not gonna. There's so many infinite possibilities out there. You're probably not gonna run into anybody. So they modified the game, but the idea of combining artificial intelligence with generative, kind of works and game engines and so forth and so on points to, the promise of what the metaverse could become, personalized kind of worlds. Now, in terms of prompt-driven AI, like I think Mid-Journey is awesome. Like I think it's a lot of fun to play with, and and it's really about prompts and the nuance of language and interpretation and mashing things up and iteration and variations, and then and you can get some really interesting results out of it. But I think like anything else, it's why are you using it and what are you trying to do with it, and what are you trying to say with it that will infinitely, because we're heralding towards mass saturation of art. That movie that we made a movie back in the 90s that I started to mention. We made it for like $900 on desktop computers. It took like 86 days to render it. It was crazy. Like, and then we did the first all digital release of a motion picture. But that movie ushered in a whole new wave of, it democratized the making of film. And then short order, like not too long after, you have the rise of social media and everybody has a device and they're able to make stuff. So NFTs are already moving towards mass saturation. With AI driven tools and the ability to build worlds, you're going to see more and more, digital based art is going to become more and more important. I think that the art has something that it's trying to say, or you're trying to express something. And even though you might go through the work that I've done on Tezos or Solana and look at it, there's kind of an evolution of a aesthetic there, right? Like you can see it and you can recognize it and you can say, oh, that's that type of work. So even when I play with Mid-Journey, I'm bringing all that 20 some odd years experience into it thinking about how I prompt it, but then also thinking about how I might manipulate what the AI is,
For sure.
break
Right.
it, do whatever I can.
Yeah, so it becomes like a true collaboration at that point because it's like passing the creation back and forth between human and machine, which is pretty fucking rad. And yeah, I totally see that evolution. It's cool because yeah, it's funny. Jesse Draxler, who's one of my favorite artists. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he makes these like super brutal, like just kind of dystopian doesn't even do a disservice. It's just insane, like brutal oil and like crazy stuff. But it was funny. Someone asked him, how long it took him to make a piece when we were in Venice together. And she was very, very nice person. But he just said it took me every single day of my life up until this moment right now to make the piece. And I thought that was like one of the best responses I'd ever heard to the question, because it really is. It's a collection of every single experience you've ever had, really distilled into a single image for somebody to digest in 5 seconds, which is fucking crazy. And it becomes so nuts because you're trying to communicate your entire experience up to that point in the moment it takes somebody to scroll past it in the midst of celebrity gossip or whatever the hell else, screaming pornography or anything else that they're scrolling through. So it's interesting, man, for sure. Yeah, I see it absolutely. Like and that Frankenstein stuff sounds absolutely nuts. Like I wish I could have gone to that. It sounds so cool. So in that Frankenstein world, did you find yourself, or I guess in your world, which it seems like you have delved into the depths of AI and the capabilities of training AI, and I want to get into that a little bit later. But like, how does this impact your view on like mortality and just existing as a human? I know that you kind of said, like, obviously it shifts the way that you perceive humanity in some ways, right? Or in many ways. And then could you get into that a little bit? And then also on the mortality front, like I know that there's lots of, there's lots of speculation that at some point we'll be able to download our consciousness in kind of that world. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that? How do you just like, I don't know, come to grips with like essentially a living organism that isn't that is not human or not carbon based?
Yeah, there's a lot there to kind of unpack, and some of that would be, like we could spend days talking about some of those topics,
Right.
But I think that, like, in terms of the use of AI as an augmented process, in terms of an artistic process, I think we're just at the beginning of what's possible, and it's super exciting. In terms of the mortality thing and the challenge of a lot of this, when we were doing Frankenstein AI, it's what's known as a discursive design kind of artifact, right? It was intended to kind of create debate and discussion about the ethics, policy, design practice around artificial intelligence, right? Because at that time there was really a lot, and still is the case, there's a lot of bias within AI. There's a lot of question of who gets to actually design what it is and what's embedded in it because of that, and so all kinds of things that you've seen, just where certain facial recognition technology that's connected to AI might not recognize darker types of skin, like all kinds of bias that's all over it. Really crazy, right? Like, so that project was trying to allow people to have a creative experience with an AI in a way, to help make a ubiquitous technology more accessible. Because immediately, most of the narratives that we know about artificial intelligence, you automatically jump to what was it? It was Skynet and Terminator. Like very dystopian, right? Your views of it have been dictated by science fiction and in terms of literature and in film. So a lot of people have misconceptions of it, and we should be afraid of it too, right? Like we should be aware of what it can do and be mindful in terms of how we're developing it. But I think it has really interesting applications in a broad range of ways to augment the creative process. Some of the early prompt driven looks, like if you look now, like just as recent references, you know, we're seeing what's going on with like quoted things creating
Yes.
images, right? Like I type a statement and it becomes an image, right?
Yeah.
And then you have recently, there's been a really interesting ethical debate around AIs being used within, like there was an Anthony Bourdain documentary where they
Yeah.
did voiceover and used
Yeah.
AI to create the voiceover in it, you know, and
Yeah.
obviously he passed, right? So he never said those words. So they were extrapolating and training it off a variety of different conversations that he had previously. They recently, most recently, the blockbuster Top Gun, you know, because Val Kilmer has throat cancer.
Oh, right.
They used AI to do all his scenes as Iceman in it, right? Like
Wow.
so you're seeing it be used in a variety of ways. So it's interesting to kind of think about where it's potentially headed. You know, usually the technology starts with images and then moves to music. The file sizes
Mhm.
are smaller, and then eventually moves into motion, right? So you could imagine at some point I'll be able to sit down and type out a scene, you know,
And
and then
just,
it'll become a visual thing, right? Like,
yeah.
which is really crazy, right? Like,
Yeah.
so like when you start to think about that, it really comes down. We did another project at the lab with AI, which called Project Immerse. We spent a bunch of time studying QAnon and
Yep.
kind of looking at how apathenia, which is this idea that you look, people find patterns in things and through those patterns tell stories, and stories are how we make sense of the world, right? And so that project was really wild because we were working with AI in it, but we purposely were working, unlike when we built the AI for Frankenstein AI, we said, hey, let's do this project where we use accessible tools that require no coding. So
Yep.
it's very indicative of how anybody could pick up and use and leverage it. And the whole piece is really about misinformation and deception, right? And how it's
Right.
crafted. And so it's kind of like this. The way that it works is it uses pervasive web technologies, and we subvert them. It's kind of almost like the way it starts is you come upon this data dump, and you're not sure who's dumping it, and it's like images, news articles, and audio and video, and you start to realize it's related to a high school student who's bought this like body cam off of eBay, and then he got it to make like a body horror short film
Sure.
for class to get out of writing a paper.
Yep.
And basically what happens is he finds some stuff that hasn't been wiped off of it, right? Like he finds footage on it,
Sure.
and then something or someone comes for that footage. And
Oh
so
shit.
the whole thing is you're trying to figure out who dumped the data in the first place, why, what's the story it's trying to tell. And you work with a group of people, and then an AI comes in and starts manipulating and playing with you. So it takes place in like Miro, which is a whiteboarding
Yep. Oh, I know.
platform.
Yeah, I know Miro. Yeah.
Yeah, and in Zoom, and we build out bots that go into the Zoom breakout rooms and start impersonating you, and then you're not sure who's real or not. You start to come to rely upon the other humans that are there, and then
Yeah.
all this data is dropping in, and you're trying to sort through it, and then you learn at the end of the piece that like, oh shit, like 90 some odd percent of what you encountered was actually made by a machine. And for that piece, we used a lot of like kind of a cut up Burroughs-esque kind of approach
Cool.
to it,
Hell
where
yeah.
we would take the text, then we retrain it, and we trained it off of like, like serial killer transcripts, prophets, all kinds of like wacky data sets, like insane
Yeah.
data sets, and the result of that is this like bombardment of information. But every time people come out with these crazy elaborate conspiracy, they sound like conspiracy theorists when they come out of the other side of it. So
Man.
like I think like when you think about it, like one side is like how we're telling these stories, and then the other side is what you were getting to in terms of the mortality and this idea of memory and how memory can be stored, and
Yep.
how what is it going to look like when, which is really interesting because it starts to talk about end of life, and
Yep.
and being able to carry on in a digital way, and makes me think of like Philip K. Dick, like
For
Ubik,
sure. That's
and
yeah.
some of those
Absolutely.
stories that come to mind. But
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. The mortality thing's fascinating, you
Yeah,
know.
it's like do you with the mortality, or I guess like also with the mortality, I guess just comes immediately along with our kind of perceived our perception of reality as a whole, and if mortality exists at all, like I just like what you're saying with these kind of manipulations and like the data dumps and just kind of I feel like it's going to be in the future, in the next 10, 20 years, it's going to be indiscernible in terms of where things are ever coming from or being generated or created or digested. So it's weird, like I just it's fascinating, and also I would say overwhelming, and kind of crushing in some ways, just or I guess the crushing and fleeting notion of our existing reality to what it probably is going to be in a couple 5 to 10 years, with the amount of deep, like you were saying, what you do with your pieces, the deep fake stuff, the voiceover stuff, not ever being able to determine like what's real or not, and then also going into that dreaded kind of pothead wormhole of is this real what we're doing right now? You know what I mean? It's like it's funny as hell, kind of an ex machina type thing where what
Yeah,
if culture hacker was a what if you were a bot, and I'm talking to a bot and this is just a prompt. Like how fucking nuts would that be if I got set up by FakeWhale, and then this is you programming you on the screen, but this isn't you. It's just a bot just reading from prompts. I feel like that'd be pretty rad, but I don't. It's just like
yeah.
nuts,
No,
dude.
I'm a real human today, but
Okay, sweet, good.
yeah, at least I think I am.
Yeah,
But no, I mean, I think that it raises so many questions. Because in some ways, a lot of the work and what I try to do, especially in the installations that I make, is really kind of allowing humanity to have a voice in shaping the technology as opposed to the
sure.
technology shaping us, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of that work, because I have another piece that's really kind of about mortality that my it started as a physical installation that I did in New York, where you would come up to a storefront and you would step into the storefront and you would be brought into like a white room, and then you would go through a visualization exercise. You'd be asked to kind of close your eyes and imagine a place that you've lived in the past or that you currently live. And then you
Mhm.
come to realize that the place is actually on fire, and you have a few moments to save something that you're emotionally connected to. And as you're reaching to grab it, once you have it in your hands, you're asked to open your eyes and then draw what the object is.
Cool.
And then you draw the object, and the stranger sitting across from you has one too. And then you trade them and you interview each other about them. And
That sounds
then
great.
and then all of a sudden it leads you to a box that's in the room, and you open it up and it has all these artifacts in it. And you come to realize that they're artifacts that belong to my father. And you are also prompted to find like a couple flashlights and a map, and then a
Mhm.
door creaks open, and you
Mhm.
step into this other hallway, and you're in a burned out house. And then
Shit.
you're walking down a long hallway that's all fire damaged. You smell smoke, and you walk down the hall, all the way down this long hall, and you step through a hole in the wall. And when you step through a hole in the wall, you step into this like rec room den that's all been
Mhm.
gutted by fire. And there's a table in the center of the room. And you look at the map and you realize, oh, wait, I think it's telling us to pick up this thing. And when you pick it up, the room comes to life, right? And the
Yeah.
table illuminates, and there's a slide projector on the table, and it
Damn.
starts to illuminate. And when you take the objects and put them onto the table, they use load sensors, so the table knows what objects in what position, and it starts to unlock these stories. Because the piece is about, I grew up in a firefighting household. My dad was a
Mhm.
volunteer firefighter and
Oh yeah.
amateur fire scene photographer. But
Yeah.
in my youth, we had like two devastating fires. Like
Oh.
a van erupted in flames on a vacation, and then our house
Oh.
burned down like 11 months later. And I always wondered if my dad actually set them. And so, like, as he got diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer and he was dying, he invited me to come and interview him and ask him anything I wanted.
Yeah.
So the piece is kind of like this investigative piece.
Holy
I
shit,
start
man.
to uncover all these skeletons in the closet, get to
Holy.
know who my dad is. It's really wild. And then it's set against all these slides, because when he died, I found thousands and thousands of slides, beautiful, haunting,
Yeah.
devastating photographs of fires,
Yeah.
all kinds of things burning. And so he's very much like an outsider artist. Like his
Sure.
stuff, I'm working on an art book for it, and a whole bunch of
Fucking.
different things, because the
Yeah.
stuff is incredible. It's like a
Yeah. Yeah.
time capsule from 1968 to 88 in terms
Cool.
of just fire photography. But so as you move through this piece, you're uncovering these stories, right? And you're moving through something that's really kind of capturing the memory of, like, how memory is malleable, right?
Yeah. Right.
You're hearing these interviews, but it's generative documentary. So every time somebody goes through and moves those objects on the table, it's always different. So nobody gets the same order, nobody gets the same thing. So, like, I'm fascinated in terms of your question about, like, mortality. What does it mean to have a generative work that's continually changing over
Right.
time, and that is really impacted by your interaction with it?
Right.
And we collected all the data from those different shows. I could rerun the shows, or I could do anything that I wanted with the data
Yeah.
out of that. But the idea of generative work is really interesting, because I'm often asked about the work, because I'm also I work in traditional forms where you have a
Sure.
beginning, middle, and end. The
Yep.
piece I mentioned to you, these installations and what I do with the digital work is always evolving, right? Like, it's like Godard said famously, like, that he made movies with beginning, middles, and ends, but not in that particular order, right? Like, the idea that,
Yeah.
it's kind of coming at you from all different vantages and viewpoints. And if you've ever watched a Godard film, especially like Weekend, you can
Mhm.
totally feel that, in the
Yeah.
work. So I think it's just interesting to think about generative works, memory, how it's malleable, what does it mean, our ability to interact with it, the potential of worlds being built generatively, like all the things we've been talking about earlier in this conversation, really kind of the way in which we'll remember our own lives as we're
Yeah.
living them, how others will remember us after we're gone, how they would, like, what life will be, in that
Yeah.
context is really fascinating.
Yeah, it's weird. You raise a really cool point. I think that that is the really fascinating part about generative, is that it's perpetual evolution of it. The malleability. It's an organism, really, like we've been talking about, kind of its own living and breathing thing. It's funny. It's funny. It really reminds me of this short story. Have you ever read the Cares of a Family Man by Kafka?
Mhm.
So it's just this kind of, like it brings me back to that world that he created in like 3 paragraphs, where it's just like this guy's frustration with this being that has, allegedly no purpose in life. And then, like, why is that thing going to get to live forever? When, the author or narrator kind of examines his mortality and then thinks about, why do I have to die when I have, purpose? And it just kind of gives that whole thing of, well, what is purpose and what is legacy? And why is that being's legacy, any less valuable than your legacy, even though it doesn't have the purpose that you want to give it? So I don't know. It's super interesting. And it's like, it's that constant battle I think we all have as artists in some ways, about about what we want to be remembered for or not remembered or anything like that. It's pretty cool. Yeah. So where did you grow up? You mentioned your dad was a volunteer firefighter. You seem like you're Midwestern for some reason. Maybe I'm projecting, but
Oh, no, I'm actually East Coast based. I mean,
you're
I've lived
East
all
Coast.
over. Yeah, I've lived all over the place, but I grew up not too far from Philadelphia.
Okay, cool, sweet.
So
And did you
that's
and you mentioned, I mean, if you don't mind me prying a little bit, like you mentioned there was some suspicion in that, like the fire setting itself. Where did that suspicion come from? I'm kind of going through that story. I mean, the exhibition sounds absolutely nuts. I mean, and that's the other kind of correlative I had to that. Is that still up somewhere, or do you just have all the archival data that you collected there and you can, like, bring it back to life in that way?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of the projects I do, they kind of evolve over time, right? So it started as a physical installation. It was commissioned to go to a number of places. So it was at the Tribeca International Film Festival in 2019. And
Cool.
so I opened it down in Tribeca in a storefront on Canal Street in conjunction with a really great group called Wall Play. They have since folded, but they had a really cool model where they would go and they would take storefronts that weren't being used, and they would lease them, and then they would do shows and they would open them up to artists. So
Cool.
I got the storefront in conjunction with them, and then built out the whole installation. And it was commissioned to go to a number of different places, but then COVID hit and kind of derailed that, right? And so
Yeah,
then I started looking at it, I started thinking like, oh, there's a lot of loss going on, because the piece is really about memory and
for
loss and
sure.
life.
Yep.
And so I started playing more with pervasive web tools and subverting them, like productivity tools like Miro and Zoom, and
Yep.
turning them into collaborative storytelling, and experiential things, right? Like, and so with the project called Where There's Smoke, so I started running shows like that, and I ran like
Cool.
probably upwards of probably close to like 80 some of them, right? Like
Cool.
over the pandemic, and I would run them, and I thought, oh, I'll just do it. I'll start and I'll just run it on a Sunday at like 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
And then it just kept, more and more people kept coming and coming and coming. And I ended up doing the run, all the way into the spring, and then took it out to a couple different festivals like Currents New Media Festival, and then a couple other places. And then I have now been commissioned to have it return as an exhibition. So it'll be set up for 3 months in 2023 in like a 2,000 square foot space.
Dude, hell yeah.
It'll be tied into a live show I've been working on, like a one-person show
Cool.
where I do it in a theater setting, and then I bring in virtual audiences while I'm doing the live show, and then it connects to the physical installation.
Sweet.
And then I'm doing some cool things with the blockchain with it as well.
Cool.
So that piece will be able to be seen, and I still run the virtual version of it, but
Yeah.
I found like about 60,000 slides from my
Yeah.
dad, and the suspicion that you were asking me about.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it kind of came from a couple different things. Like when I would go through and I would break down, like there were all these really, really fascinating, just weird things. Like my dad worked on the night shift. He was like an enigma. I really never knew exactly what he did. And then later I found out like he worked for the government,
Whoa.
and so I found out later on like really what he was doing, And so like some of the mystery of him being an enigma added to my own, and I'm a storyteller, right? So I maybe extrapolated, but then there were really weird things, like he worked the night shift. He would normally come home in the morning. He went fishing by himself that morning. My two brothers were home alone when the fire broke out. They were considerably younger than me at the time. They were able to get out. They were able to save our dog. So everything worked out okay. But like where he was, nobody could account for. Then the dryer, it was a dryer fire, and we grew up like with like a lot of fire safety, right?
Right. I mean, if he's a fireman.
Stop, drop, and roll, like all this. We have evacuation plans.
Yeah.
There was there next to the dryer, there was a kind of a vent, but the vent wasn't fireproofed, and the fire was burned. It was a 5-alarm fire. It burned burned like perfectly upstairs in the attic while it was burning downstairs.
Whoa.
It was a phenomenal, really high level fire. And it all stemmed from this dryer. When the fire inspector came, he was upset because the dryer had been moved into the backyard and wasn't in the original place where it was
Oh, fuck.
started. So there was all this weird stuff that kind of happened. Now, whether that was like, my
Like,
dad was there and people moved it, or the firefighters moved it because they knew my dad,
right.
or, they like, who knows, right? Like, but
Yeah,
it
yeah.
all these layers of
Holy
mystery, right?
shit,
And
man.
like, you're wondering about it. And then as I grew up, I used to go with my dad. We had like a room that in our rec room, we had all these fire scanners, right? Police
Yeah.
scanners. One would go off, and then my dad had like this VW bug, right? That had a little magnetic light. He'd throw it on top, and I'd go with him, and I'd like load film and change lenses and stuff.
Holy
And I was
shit.
9, 10, 11 years old, and
Yeah.
he would just drive like a maniac, and we would go to wherever a fire was, and we'd be behind the scenes,
Dude.
like just and shooting photographs, and you'd be right in the action of what a blaze was. Sometimes when I reflect on it, we showed up before the
Before.
fire company
Yeah.
showed up, right? Like we showed up, so there was all these things that I always wondered about. And it
Yeah.
just, my dad was like really awesome in the sense that, he passed away. He didn't have a chance to see it. He died right before. But as I started interviewing, then he started collaborating with me on the installation.
That's awesome,
And
dude.
I started showing him the set stuff, and he would
Yeah.
weigh in on it. And then we talked about some of the slides and the stories. So he was an active collaborator, and still is to this day
Hell
with the
yeah.
piece. I'm
Yeah, right.
constantly art from his art, and
Yeah.
it's really cool. But the suspicions kind of came from that. And then he turned me on to like B movies and film noir when I was
Hmm.
growing up. So I think I just was wired for that,
Yeah.
the mystery side of it.
Yeah, dude. I mean, it's crazy. There's some people who are like drawn to, yeah, like that. Like fire in general is just nuts, dude. Like I almost died in a fire. We were like we moved to Chicago, and an AC unit blew up and back, and like they had like smashed. It was like wooded in, like the thing you don't do around AC units. They literally built like a wood box around it to contain it. Blew up, engulfed the entire side of the house, and like this drunk across the street was up drinking whiskey at 5 a.m. and he like kicked my window, and he's like, "Get the fuck out! There's a fire out back!" Just like going all nuts. And I'm like, "Holy shit! Like get out!" And so my buddy and I, all my friends and I, all go out there, and we're all like, like grabbing buckets from this hose and trying to put the damn thing out. And it was just nuts. Like the fireman that came, it was funny. He's like, was someone smoking a cigarette out here? Because I feel like that could have caused it. And I'm like, dude, this was not a cigarette. Like this was a crazy ass mechanical thing. But I've been like terrified, dude. I cannot deal with fire anymore. Like it was definitely a pretty insanely traumatic thing. Dude,
A lot
go
of
ahead.
times it's smoke that gets you,
Yeah,
like
you
that's
just
what,
suffocate. And yeah, oh, it's nuts, man. Well, the thing that you kind of alluded to briefly, and I found hilarious and also conducive to kind of what I do currently. So I work a piece of shit, 9 to 5, essentially creating digital waste for a company that, I mean, just for just flooding inboxes with stuff that nobody cares about. And so I really loved that you are using Miro and Zoom because I haven't seen those used in an artistic way, only a soul crushing way to, beat people into productivity. So I really loved that like small analogy you made that you were using those tools. How did you start thinking about those? Wasn't examining those for what they're made to be in terms of like the brutal productivity that they're supposed to fuel us with as, people who are just, built to kind of serve these corporations and these businesses? Is that kind of what inspired you to use those particular tools, or were they just the best tools possible for your storytelling?
well, a lot of times I'll kind of be based on the affordances and constraints of a particular tool, right? Like, and it
Sure.
always starts with like what I want to express or what I want to say. So in the piece, the theme of that particular piece is, as my dad was dying, it's kind of about being clouded by grief, and then
Yeah.
this idea of being alone but together, right? Like, so when somebody's dying, a lot of people are around you, but they never know what to say, and they mean well, but you can't, and then the system is really difficult to navigate. And I
Yeah.
thought, wow, wouldn't it be really cool if I could create like a space that allowed people to move through the story? Because a
Hmm.
lot of it ends up using like, it gives editorial permission with the tool. So I do a lot of really cool kind of collaging in it. So it has like
Cool.
journal entries and audio
Sure.
and video and, these elements then people can start to excavate, right? And then
Yeah.
and it uses a lot of like lines, like the way you have lines in a hand, like you'll have a lifeline, like when
Cool.
somebody reads your poem. So you move through it through all these lines, but there's so much in the piece that you can never see everything. Right.
Yep.
Like, so, and then later it resolves and you realize how much there was. And you're kind of like, oh, I didn't get a chance to see that or that or that or that. So it's
Yeah.
really kind of about, where are you putting your focus? What do you choose? How are you being present? What are you choosing to give your time to? What's important to you? Right. And so I thought, oh, I can take and subvert elements of the interactivity within that board, and I can make them evoke these aesthetics, right? Like this aesthetic that I want to achieve, and make somebody feel something from it, right? Like,
Mhm.
and Miro was great because it's concurrent users, right? So it's in an infinite canvas. So it was a really great space for it. And then I thought, oh, it'd be really cool to use Zoom. Everybody's using Zoom. They're
Yep.
all used to it. But what if I use Zoom and it's just voice only?
Yeah.
And it's us talking while we're in the space. And it's kind of like the way the piece works is you're navigating with others, because you're all of a sudden like, hey, I found this thing, I'm over here. And they're like, where are you? I'm over by this thing. And they're trying to wayfind each other
Sure.
in this thing. And it's kind of like, I wanted it to be like the equivalent of like if you go to a music festival with some friends and you get split
Yeah.
up and
Yep.
somebody's like texting you to like, hey, I'm
Like,
over here, where are you? I'm over
yeah.
there, blah blah blah. And you're trying to find each other, but then later when you're drinking or eating afterwards or whatever, you start talking about the experience you had, and somebody's like,
Yep.
oh, did you see that guy that was doing this thing? He was over on the stilts and
Yeah.
he was climbing up, and somebody's like, oh no, I was over here, did you see that? And you're like, oh yeah, I remember seeing that, but I wasn't there at that time. I saw this and I heard this other thing.
Yeah.
And it stitched together an experience, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that each of you is adding to, and it's really powerful. And I thought, wow, Miro can achieve that, and Zoom can allow
Cool.
me to let that happen. And so it was really about the aesthetics of the piece and what
Yeah.
I wanted to say with it. And then I was like, oh, it's so awesome to subvert this stuff. It's all about productivity, and to
Yeah.
subvert it and like, let's turn it into something that's about collaborative storytelling and healing. That's
Sure.
totally different than what it's used for.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I love, like, I love that kind of stuff when you're subverting the tools, right? Like,
Absolutely.
because I think like the whole category, like where we are right now, like one of the biggest design challenges I'm fascinated by. I'm very bullish on decentralized technology. I'm excited by it, and some of the reasons I'm so excited by it are the potential of being able to own, networks with other people. This
Yeah.
idea of moving away from some of the woes and challenges that we faced, like
Yep.
moving back towards the promise of what the internet originally was before it got all commodified, and taken over by a few entities and
Yep.
dominated by algorithms, right? So the part that is exciting to me about decentralized tech is, how do we subvert the transactional nature of it, right? Like
Yeah.
everybody, all the language around it, everything around it is like about transaction.
Yep.
But what if you start to use the ledger as a way? We have this other piece we're working on that's really cool. It's called Blockchain Fairy Tales, and
Hmm.
it's kind of like this idea of it's this idea of new myth making, right? And this notion of like seven generational storytelling, and this idea of oral traditions of storytelling, and this notion of like how do we organize kind of communities over time to tackle some of the most pressing issues that we face. Like
Yeah.
we have like a 7-year timeline right now that's critical to climate. Like, are we going to step up and actually, it's like
Yeah.
game over if we don't if we
Right.
don't we don't hit that 7-year goal, right? Like, and decentralized technologies are interesting in an age where trust in systems and institutions is totally eroding, right? And the promise of a trustless system, because anytime money gets involved, people get crazy.
Yeah.
They're like, they justify whatever their actions are in their own mind, and they end up just trying to take more and
For
more, right?
sure.
It's
Right.
very, very extractive, right? So
Yeah.
the extractive models that exist, how can they be subverted and used in interesting ways? So with that blockchain fairy tales project, you end up going through it with a bunch of people, and you end up realizing you're going through a variety of different organizational models that are used for collaboration. Um,
Oh,
and then it leads into, it starts with like shared values and your kind of some governance and how are
sure.
you managing what you choose to do. And then it kind of dovetails into this thing that's kind of about like, okay, how could you take what you did here and apply it to the formation of a DAO? Because
Hell
a
yeah.
lot of, like, right now, every day, maybe like 100 or so DAOs are being created. It's kind of like the beginning of the web where people were registering sites, a few
Yeah.
hundred, and then millions, right?
Yeah.
So like DAOs are this really interesting vehicle for collaboration, for groups to come together as collectives and do action. And so I'm interested in that challenge, right? Like a lot of the things that we see in the space is like art is becoming commodified. Like I'm
Yeah.
constantly torn by scarcity models that are being
Yeah.
used abundantly right now because they're old
Yeah.
world art models, and yet we live in an age of digital abundance, right? And how can we start to think about decentralized technologies in a way that's not so rooted in capitalism,
For
right?
sure.
Like
Yep.
be more open to the arts, or you know problem solving or challenges that we face, because I think the infrastructural opportunity there is really exciting.
Yeah.
It eases, it has the potential to ease some of the challenges with working with large groups of people around common or shared goals.
Yeah.
So so I'm fascinated by some of
Cool.
that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's funny you say like, yeah, I think that a lot of us are struggling with that. Yeah, the whole like scarcity thing. And it's funny. Like I see that you're obviously a super prolific, like there's just tons. I'm similar where, and I think that is kind of a necessary, like almost just abandoning, well, I mean, not almost, just absolutely adhering to the fact that creation for the sake of creation is going to always be the best way to build something. You know what I mean? Like having something in mind for a project or something you're doing, I feel like is almost, I don't know, maybe it's a childish thought, but it's just when you have that intention of I want to do this, I want to sell this thing to this, I feel like it loses a lot of, the heart that it had before. You know what I mean? Like I'm sure that when you were creating, if there's smoke, you weren't, you want as many people to experience that and to you know, interact with and, have that kind of emotional connection with. But and maybe again, I'm kind of projecting, but it's not like you had created that thing based on like, this is going to take over the world, or this is going to make this X amount of money for me or something like that. And that's why I think that project in particular sounds so insane, because it probably, and again, you can get into it a little bit, but it seems like it was created from, a place of self-exploration, a place of, trying to discover, things that you didn't know, and just really, tapping into some potentially unaddressed emotions that, you've been wrestling with for a while too. So that sounds really cool. And yeah, it's an interesting concept for sure. Creation for the sake of creation versus creation for the sake of consumption. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that because a lot of the ways that I started moving into doing NFTs really, even though I originally we were going to do a blockchain fairy tales years ago, we were going
Yeah.
to do it in 2018, but we ended up doing the Frankenstein AI because it was the 200th anniversary of the
Yeah.
book,
Yeah.
and it's like the right time. But in 2019, I because I was really like I had followed and was really kind of inspired by Beeple's like everyday project. I just thought like the
For
discipline of
sure.
doing something every day was
It's rad.
really
Yeah.
it was really really awesome,
Yeah.
and so in 2019 I tried to do one, right, and I got a couple days in and failed miserably, right, like it totally derailed on me. And then I tried again in 2020 and got all the way to the pandemic, and got derailed by it. But then I tried again in January 1st, 2021, and I've been going strong ever since, right? Like, so I'm like 500 and some odd days in,
Oh, yeah.
and I just got, at first it was really hard really hard. And then it got to the point of where it just became like second nature, right? And
Yeah.
now I'm like, I love doing it, and it's challenged me all throughout. And it's wild to go back and look at how all the work has evolved. Like if you look at my Instagram for it, which I just go by my name, Lance Weiler, if you look at it, you just see the evolution of the work over the time. But what was interesting was, Instagram's it's a Web 2.0 platform, right? So I'm the product, right? They leverage the work, and hopefully maybe the algorithm allows people to see the work,
Right.
But then it might change at some point and might cut me off or whatever, right? Like they're in control. But I thought, it'd be really interesting to start minting some of this stuff. And I had started on a Ethereum, and then I philosophically ended up leaving that chain because of the proof of stuff. And I landed on in early March, right as it was starting, I started experimenting with Hic Nunc.
Same. Same.
And I was like, oh my God, I love this. I loved it because, and you probably can relate to this, when it first started, and pretty much through most of its life, it was really, it felt like it was an art project unto itself. The interface, you weren't sure what was happening. Things wouldn't work. You were like, like it was just crazy, but I loved it because there was no algorithm, there was no curation. It was literally like falling down rabbit holes, and it made me fall in love with the internet again, right? Like the internet that I remembered from long ago. And I was like, wow, this is totally rad. This is amazing. And it had a Southern kind of hemisphere kind of thing going on in terms of its approach and what Raphael was doing with it. And it wasn't backed by, VCs or angel investors. It didn't have shareholders. In fact, everybody was part of the community, and everybody was, it was an open source project, and, it was just awesome. Right. And so I just started putting the stuff up, and I just started experimenting in all kinds of ways with different ways to kind of release it. And I loved that platform had multiple editions, and that you could burn things, and that, it was just awesome, right? Like, so you could start to experiment with how you released it. And I started to think that when I would make a piece, the creative process included me minting it and putting it on the blockchain.
For sure.
So I was constantly putting stuff up. And, colleagues of mine would say, like, dude, you're oversaturating the market.
You're
and
like,
I'd be
dude,
like,
it doesn't matter.
it doesn't matter to me.
It's fucking crazy.
But then the stuff, like, they were collecting it too, right? Like, so it wasn't like it was just that I made some decisions and choices that were counter to traditional choices or the way that people were emulating things. I was like giving my stuff away. I was like doing
it was great.
I was totally so into that, right? Like I was swapping with other artists. I was doing collabs. I was just off the hook, having a blast. But I think that, being prolific with it allowed me to, I'm really I feel very fortunate. Like I've been able to make the work and do very well with the digital art, but for me, I'm in a place where it was an expression, right? Like I fortunately, I wasn't in a situation where I had to live solely from it. I did phenomenally well with it, continue to do really well with it, but it's not my sole livelihood, right? Like, so I'm able to kind of experiment more with it. And I would just love to see more use cases that are challenging the way in which we're, going about the models of how the work is discovered, how the work is collected, because I think those are going to break it wide open. They're going to open it in a way that's unexpected. Like one of the things with Hic Nunc that was so awesome was it inspired a whole new collector base of people. For sure. Like the way that it operated allowed for that,
Yeah, I couldn't have collected any art before, and art was, and still sometimes is, $5 or $6 or $10 or $20. So it's just like, sweet, I love this piece. Like I'm grabbing it right there. And yeah, you're right, man. There was like this crazy, it was just a frenzy, and I oftentimes describe it as though we had all taken psychedelics and we're all vomiting into the same toilet. And then like Hick and Nuke was like the overflow. And like that was like overflowing into the traditional art world. And they were like forced to reckon with whatever it was we were doing. It was like fucking, oh man, it was so great. It was such a, it was brutal and psychotic, and like every day you would just go in and you're right, it was just a complete data dump, and there was kind of bringing it back to our original thing, there was no bias in there. It was just that's what happened at the time, have at it or don't have at it, and then you could just keep scrolling forever or not scroll. So it was like really this kind of this world that was void of any type of manipulation or perversion or anything like that. It was fucking awesome, man. I miss it quite a bit. But yeah, I feel like, I mean, that's probably a good place to wrap actually, because, FakeWhale, obviously, big into the Tezos blockchain, their curation and their museum, which I'm sure that you're going to be putting a piece in, is another like super rad concept where it's just something that's not for sale, right? This is like, these are pieces that live in this vault forever for as long as we live, or if we're even living right now. And so, yeah, I wanted to take a minute to, thank you, Culture Hacker. Thank you so much for your time today. It was a super interesting conversation. I'm blown away by your shit. I can't wait to, delve into it further. And then, FakeWhale, thank you so much for allowing me to interview, and, your continued kind of support in the culture and carrying on the name of Hick and Nuke that will never die and will live on forever in our heads. But yeah, thank you, dude.
Yeah, and thanks so much. I mean, I think shout out to FakeWhale. I think that idea of a permanent collection is so awesome, and it's exactly like what we were just talking about a few moments ago. How do you demonstrate different thought around the approach of collecting art and celebrating what art is, and helping to support the arts? So excited to be here, and it was great to talk with you today. Thank you.
Hell yeah.